Kaya Brennan pressed her back against the cold metal of her locker, watching the steady stream of students flow past her like water around a stone. The hallways of Roosevelt High School buzzed with the particular energy that came just before first period. A mixture of sleepy complaints about early morning classes, excited chatter about weekend plans, and the underlying tension that seemed to permeate every high school corridor she'd ever walked down. At barely 5 feet tall, she found herself constantly looking up at the faces that surrounded her, most of which looked right through her as if she were made of glass. Her wild auburn curls had once again escaped the confines of the hair tie she'd wrestled them into that morning, creating a halo of unruly spirals that caught the fluorescent light streaming down from the ceiling fixtures. She'd inherited the hair from her Irish grandmother, along with the freckles that dotted her pale skin like scattered cinnamon across milk. Her mother had always said the combination made her look like a fairy tale princess, but here at Roosevelt, it felt more like a target painted on her forehead. The oversized flannel shirt she wore, a blue and green plaid that had seen better days, hung loose on her small frame, deliberately chosen from the clearance rack at the base exchange to hide the lean muscle that 8 years of martial arts training had built beneath her seemingly fragile exterior. The sleeves were rolled up to her wrists, revealing forearms that were stronger than they appeared, marked with small scars from countless hours of practice and conditioning. Her faded jeans, also from the exchange, were practical rather than fashionable, with reinforced knees that spoke to a life lived more actively than her classmates might assume. Wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on her freckled nose, constantly sliding down due to the slight bend in the frame where they'd been accidentally stepped on during her last move. She pushed them up with her index finger, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing, and adjusted the worn backpack strap that was digging into her thin shoulder. The backpack itself told a story of military life. Patches from 3 different states sewn over holes and weak spots, zippers that stuck but still worked, pockets organized with the precision that came from living out of boxes and suitcases for most of her 17 years. Roosevelt High School sprawled across several buildings in downtown Phoenix like a red brick fortress against the desert landscape. The architecture spoke to a different era, when schools were built to last rather than to impress, with thick walls that kept out the relentless Arizona heat, and windows positioned to catch the morning light without creating afternoon furnaces. The campus housed nearly 2,000 students from all over the metropolitan area, a melting pot of military kids, long-term residents, and everyone in between. The social hierarchy here seemed as rigid as any she'd encountered in her numerous relocations, but somehow more complex, as if the sheer size of the student body required additional layers of classification and exclusion. Kaya had been navigating these hallways for 3 months now, ever since her father, Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, had received orders transferring him to Luke Air Force Base. It was their 7th move in 10 years, and while she'd grown accustomed to the routine of packing, relocating, and starting over, something about Roosevelt felt different. Maybe it was her age. 17 was harder than 12 when it came to making friends and finding your place. Maybe it was the size of the school, which made it easier to get lost in the crowd, but harder to find genuine connections. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired, bone-deep weary of always being the new girl with the second-hand clothes and the carefully neutral accent that revealed nothing about where she'd actually grown from. The morning ritual was always the same. Arrive early enough to claim her locker space before the hallways became too crowded. Organize her books according to the day's schedule with military precision inherited from her father, and then make herself as invisible as possible until the first bell rang. She'd learned that the 20 minutes before classes began were the most dangerous. This was when social groups solidified their daily hierarchies, when yesterday's slights were remembered and today's targets were selected, when the unspoken rules of teenage survival were either followed or dramatically violated. Most days, Kaya managed to slip through these 20 minutes unnoticed, a ghost in flannel and faded denim who attracted no more attention than the scuffed linoleum beneath her worn sneakers. She'd perfected the art of looking busy while doing nothing, of appearing engaged while remaining completely separate from the social ecosystem that surrounded her. It was a survival skill she'd developed over years of being the outsider, the newcomer, the girl whose father wore a uniform and whose life was dictated by the needs of national defense rather than the comfortable rhythms of civilian existence. Her schedule was carefully planned to minimize contact with what she'd mentally classified as high-risk social situations. She ate lunch alone in the library, where Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, had taken pity on her and allowed her to claim a small table near the science fiction section. During group projects, she volunteered for research roles that could be completed independently, then shared her findings via email rather than forcing awkward in-person collaborations. In gym class, she deliberately chose spots in the back row where her athletic abilities wouldn't be quite so obvious, where she could blend in with the other students who preferred anonymity to the spotlight. What none of her classmates knew, what none of them could possibly guess from her quiet demeanor and self-effacing posture, was that Kaya Brennan was a weapon wrapped in an oversized flannel shirt. 8 years of mixed martial arts training had transformed her small frame into something precise and dangerous, a collection of reflexes and techniques that had been honed in dojos across 3 different states. Her father had insisted on the training from the time she was 9 years old, partly for self-defense in their nomadic lifestyle, but mostly because he understood that a military family lived differently from their civilian counterparts. They faced different risks, encountered different challenges, and sometimes found themselves in situations where traditional responses simply weren't enough. Every morning before school, while her classmates were hitting snooze buttons and grabbing Pop-Tarts for breakfast, Kaya was in the converted garage of their base housing, practicing combinations that flowed like water but struck like hammers. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut. Her hands moved through the air with precision that spoke to thousands of hours of repetition. Her footwork was equally polished, a careful dance that allowed her to generate maximum power while maintaining perfect balance. Grappling techniques came just as naturally, her body automatically shifting and adjusting to invisible opponents, practicing throws and holds and escapes until they became as natural as walking. The heavy bag in the corner of the garage bore the marks of her dedication. Deep impressions where her elbows and knees had found their targets, worn spots where her knuckles had connected with satisfying impact. The floor was marked with tape in precise patterns, creating a training space that could be replicated in any garage, any basement, any empty room where a military family might find themselves. This portable dojo had followed them from Colorado to North Carolina, to Nevada, and now to Arizona, each location requiring only minor adjustments to accommodate local climate and space restrictions. Her father had been her first instructor, teaching her the basics of self-defense with the same methodical approach he brought to maintaining military vehicles. But as her skills developed and his duties became more demanding, he'd sought out proper instruction from qualified teachers at each new assignment. Master Chen in Colorado Springs had taught her the flowing movements of traditional karate. Sensei Rodriguez in Fayetteville had introduced her to the brutal efficiency of Muay Thai. Professor Martinez in Las Vegas had shown her the chess-like complexity of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Each instructor had added layers to her understanding, contributing pieces to a martial arts education that was both broad and deep. The training wasn't just physical. Her father had made sure she understood the mental and emotional aspects of combat, the importance of discipline and restraint, the difference between self-defense and aggression. Real warriors, he'd told her countless times, know when not to fight. Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry. It takes real strength to walk away when you know you could win. But walking away was exactly what Kaya had been doing since arriving at Roosevelt. And it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain her father's prescribed path of non-violence. The problem had started almost immediately during her first week when she was still trying to navigate the school's complex layout and social geography. She'd been studying her schedule near the football trophy case, trying to figure out the most efficient route between her chemistry and English classes, when she'd accidentally backed into someone while reading the room numbers on her paper. "Watch where you're going, freak!" The voice had carried enough volume to cut through the general hallway noise, causing several nearby students to turn and stare. Kaya had looked up and up and up into the coldest blue eyes she'd ever encountered. Blake Morrison stood 6 feet tall, with perfectly styled blonde hair that looked like it belonged in a shampoo commercial, the kind of effortless perfection that spoke to expensive salons and professional styling products. His Letterman jacket stretched across broad shoulders that came from serious weight training, and his entire posture radiated the kind of confidence that could only come from a lifetime of being told he was special. "I'm sorry," Kaya had mumbled, instinctively stepping back and clutching her schedule tighter. "I didn't see you there." Blake's eyes had narrowed as he looked her up and down, taking in her second-hand clothes and nervous posture with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. Behind him, 2 other boys had materialized. Tyler Chen, tall and lean with dark hair and cruel eyes, and Marcus Rodriguez, shorter but stockier, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. They flanked Blake like bodyguards, clearly accustomed to their roles in whatever drama was about to unfold. "You didn't see me?" Blake had asked, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "How could you miss someone this big? Unless you're blind on top of being stupid." Tyler had snickered, a sound like breaking glass. "Maybe she needs stronger glasses. Those things look like they came from the bargain bin." Kaya's training had kicked in automatically. Her weight had shifted slightly onto the balls of her feet. Her hands had unclenched to hang loose and ready at her sides. Her breathing had deepened and steadied. Every instinct screamed at her to respond to the threat assessment her subconscious mind was conducting. Blake was bigger, but moved like someone who relied on size rather than skill. Tyler was quick, but carried himself like someone who'd never been in a real fight. Marcus was the wild card, compact and tense in a way that suggested he might actually know how to use his fists. But louder than her training instincts were her father's words, echoing through her mind like a military cadence. "No fighting unless absolutely necessary. No drawing attention. No risking the disciplinary issues that could jeopardize my career." Staff Sergeant Brennan was up for promotion to Master Sergeant, an advancement that would mean better housing, higher pay, and increased respect within the military community. A daughter with a disciplinary record could derail those plans, could mark him as someone who couldn't manage his own household, let alone the complex logistics that came with senior NCO responsibilities. So instead of responding with the techniques that had become second nature, Kaya had simply mumbled another apology and tried to sidestep around the trio. Blake, however, had other plans. His hand shot out and grabbed her backpack strap, yanking it off her shoulder with enough force to send her stumbling backward. Books and papers scattered across the linoleum floor, her carefully organized schedule floating down like autumn leaves. "I'm talking to you," Blake had said, his voice carrying the particular edge that bullies used when they sensed weakness. "When someone talks to you, you look at them. It's called respect." Kaya had dropped to her knees, frantically gathering her scattered belongings while fighting the urge to grab Blake's ankle and send him crashing into the trophy case behind him. It would have been so easy, a simple ankle pick that would put him flat on his back before he even understood what was happening. Instead, she'd focused on collecting her papers, very aware of the growing audience of students who had stopped to watch the entertainment. "Look at her scramble," Marcus had laughed. "Like a little mouse picking up crumbs." "More like a cockroach," Tyler had added, deliberately stepping on one of her handouts, scurrying around on the floor where it belongs. The laughter from their small audience had burned in Kaya's ears as she'd carefully extracted her assignment from under Tyler's sneaker, trying to smooth out the footprint that now decorated her biology notes. She'd gathered everything as quickly as possible and hurried away, leaving Blake and his friends to enjoy their moment of dominance while she disappeared into the crowd of students heading to first period. That had been the beginning. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign of harassment that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the invisible lines that separated pranks from assault, teasing from abuse, accidents from deliberate cruelty. Blake Morrison, she'd quickly learned, was an artist when it came to psychological torture, and he'd clearly decided that the quiet new girl with the second-hand clothes and military bearing would make an excellent canvas for his work. The incidents had escalated gradually, each one designed to probe her limits while maintaining plausible deniability. During lunch, Blake and his friends would accidentally bump into her table, sending her carefully arranged meal sliding across the surface or onto the floor. The first time it happened, she'd assumed it really was an accident. Cafeterias were crowded places and collisions were inevitable. But when Blake had smiled at her with cold satisfaction while mumbling a perfunctory apology, she'd understood that the encounter was entirely intentional. "Oops," he'd said, watching her try to salvage her sandwich from the floor. "Guess you should eat somewhere with more room. Maybe the bathroom?" His friends had laughed, as if he'd said something genuinely witty, and several nearby students had joined in, caught up in the moment without really understanding what they were witnessing. Kaya had simply cleaned up the mess and gone hungry that day, rather than risk another confrontation by going through the lunch line again. The hallway encounters were more frequent and varied. Blake had an uncanny ability to time his appearances to coincide with her movement between classes, especially during the brief passing periods when teachers were in their rooms and hallways were supervised only by overworked administrators trying to manage nearly 2,000 students. He'd appear seemingly from nowhere, shoulder-checking her into lockers or knocking books from her arms with movements that looked accidental to casual observers, but felt entirely deliberate to anyone on the receiving end. "Sorry," he'd say each time, his tone suggesting he was anything but sorry. "You're so small, I didn't see you there. Maybe you should make more noise when you walk." Tyler Chen had developed his own specialty in these encounters. He'd discovered that Kaya used the east stairwell to move between floors, a narrow, poorly lit passage that most students avoided because of the way sound echoed off the concrete walls and the general atmosphere of neglect that hung over the space. But for Kaya, it offered something more valuable than comfort: solitude. The stairwell allowed her to move between classes without navigating the crowded main hallways where social hierarchies played out in real time. Unfortunately, Tyler had noticed her pattern and begun timing his own movements to intersect with hers. He'd appear on the landing between the second and third floors, always when she was most vulnerable, arms full of books, backpack sliding off her shoulder, attention focused on not tripping over the uneven concrete steps that maintenance seemed to perpetually ignore. "Well, well," he'd say, blocking her path with his taller frame, "look what crawled out of the woodwork." Tyler's approach was different from Blake's broad-stroke humiliation tactics. He preferred psychological pressure, using his height advantage to loom over her in the confined space, standing just close enough to make her uncomfortable without technically touching her. He'd lean against the concrete wall, trapping her in the narrow passage, and speak in a voice just quiet enough that she'd have to strain to hear him. "You know nobody likes you here, right?" he'd whisper, close enough that she could smell the mint gum he always chewed. "You could disappear tomorrow and not one person would notice, not one person would care." These encounters were the worst, worse even than Blake's public humiliations. In the stairwell, there were no witnesses, No teachers who might accidentally overhear, no other students who might feel compelled to intervene. There was just Tyler's voice echoing off concrete walls, his words designed to burrow into her mind and take root like poisonous seeds. Marcus Rodriguez's contributions to the campaign were more physical. He'd perfected the art of the accidental collision, timing his movements to catch her off guard when she was most vulnerable. During class changes, he'd suddenly appear from around corners, slamming into her with enough force to send books flying while maintaining complete innocence. "Whoa, sorry," he'd say, steadying her with hands that gripped just a little too tightly, held on just a little too long. "You really need to watch where you're going. Someone could get hurt." The threats were always implied rather than explicit, delivered with smiles and concerned expressions that would look perfectly reasonable to any adult who might be watching. But Kaya could read the subtext in his dark eyes, could see the calculation behind his carefully concerned facade. Gym class was where all three of them seemed to excel at their particular brand of torment. Coach Martinez was a well-meaning man in his 50s who'd been teaching physical education since before any of his students were born, but he'd developed the particular blindness that came from seeing the same patterns year after year. He noticed the big disruptions, the fights that drew blood, the confrontations that involved screaming, but the subtle stuff, the psychological warfare that happened in plain sight, seemed to pass right by him. During volleyball, Tyler would spike balls directly at Kaya's head with enough force to cause real damage if they connected. When she'd dodge or deflect them, he'd throw his hands up in mock confusion and claim he was just playing the game. "What's wrong?" he'd ask innocently. "Can't handle a little competition?" In basketball, Marcus would guard her with an aggression that went far beyond what the game required, using his body to pin her against walls or trip her as she tried to move down the court. When she'd go down, he'd immediately offer his hand to help her up, the picture of sportsmanship for anyone who happened to be looking. Blake's gym class specialty was the locker room, where adult supervision was minimal and the concrete walls absorbed sound like a tomb. He'd wait until she was changing, then make loud comments about her appearance, her clothes, her body in ways that made her skin crawl but couldn't technically be classified as harassment by school standards. "Look at those shoes," he'd announce to anyone within earshot. "I think my little sister had a pair like that when she was in elementary school." Or, "Is that shirt supposed to be that color, or has it just been washed too many times?" The comments were always loud enough for other students to hear, designed to draw attention and laughter at her expense, while maintaining the thin veneer of casual observation rather than targeted abuse. Other girls would glance in her direction with expressions ranging from sympathy to amusement to relief that they weren't the ones being targeted. Through it all, Kaya noticed the reactions of her classmates, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Roosevelt High School operated on a complex social ecosystem where everyone understood their role and the consequences of stepping outside prescribed boundaries. Students who might otherwise be kind, decent people became complicit through their silence, their desperate desire to avoid becoming targets themselves, overriding any impulse they might have had to intervene. Emma Walsh, her lab partner in chemistry, was a perfect example. Emma was a quiet girl with mousy brown hair and intelligent eyes who clearly sympathized with Kaya's situation. She'd wince visibly when Blake made loud comments about Kaya's appearance during their shared class periods, and she'd offer apologetic smiles when the harassment became particularly obvious. But she never spoke up, never challenged the behavior, never offered anything more than silent moral support that felt more like pity than genuine friendship. "I feel bad for her," Kaya overheard Emma telling her friend Sarah one day as they worked on their periodic table assignment. "But what am I supposed to do? Blake Morrison isn't exactly someone you want to cross." Sarah had nodded in understanding, glancing nervously toward the back of the room where Blake was holding court with his usual audience. I heard he got Jenny Cardness kicked off the dance committee just because she wouldn't go to homecoming with him. Like, he actually convinced Mrs. Peterson that she was stealing decorations money. It was a sobering reminder of the reach Blake's influence had throughout the school. He wasn't just the quarterback with the perfect hair and expensive clothes. He was connected, part of a network of families and relationships that gave him power beyond what his physical presence alone might command. His father was a prominent attorney in Phoenix. His mother served on several school board committees, and his older brother had graduated from Roosevelt 3 years earlier as valedictorian and student body president. The Morrison family name carried weight in this community, and Blake had learned to wield that influence like a weapon. The teachers, too, had developed their own form of willful blindness. Mrs. Patterson, who taught Kaya's English class, would frown when disruptions occurred, but somehow always missed the moment when Blake whispered cruel remarks or Tyler flicked paper balls at the back of Kaya's head. Her timing was almost supernatural. She'd turned toward the disruption just as Blake was settling back into his seat with an expression of innocent attention, leaving her to see only the aftermath rather than the cause. "Class, please settle down," Mrs. Patterson would say, her eyes scanning the room without quite landing on anyone specific. "We have a lot of material to cover today." Mr. Thompson, who taught world history, had actually witnessed Marcus trip her in the hallway outside his classroom. Kaya had been carrying a stack of textbooks for her study group, trying to balance them while fishing her hall pass from her pocket, when Marcus had appeared from behind a group of other students. His foot shot out in a movement that was clearly intentional, catching her ankle and sending her sprawling across the linoleum floor. Books scattered in all directions, her papers flying like leaves in a windstorm. But when Mr. Thompson emerged from his classroom to investigate the commotion, Marcus was already crouched beside her, offering his hand with a concerned expression that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't seen what actually happened. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice heavy with false concern. "That looked like a really bad fall. Maybe you should be more careful." Mr. Thompson had looked at the scattered books, at Marcus's helpful posture, at Kaya's flushed face, and delivered the kind of response that had become depressingly familiar. "Everyone needs to be more careful in the hallways," he'd said. "We don't want anyone getting hurt." It was a masterclass in plausible deniability, and Kaya began to understand that Blake and his friends had been perfecting these techniques for years. They understood the system, knew how to work within its boundaries while pushing right up against its limits. They could inflict psychological damage without crossing legal lines, could create hostile environments without triggering official responses, could make someone's life miserable while maintaining their own reputations as upstanding members of the school community. The worst part was the isolation. Each incident drove home the reality that she was completely alone in this situation, that the adults charged with protecting students either couldn't or wouldn't see what was happening right in front of them. Her classmates, caught up in their own survival instincts, chose safety over solidarity. The system itself seemed designed to protect the popular students while leaving the vulnerable ones to fend for themselves. As October progressed and the harassment continued, Kaya found herself changing in ways that frightened her. The careful control she'd learned in 8 years of martial arts training began to slip. Her temper, usually kept in check by discipline, and her father's teachings started to flare at unexpected moments. She'd find herself fantasizing about what she could do to Blake and his friends, imagining scenarios where their cruelty was met with the kind of swift, decisive response her training had prepared her to deliver. Late at night, lying in her narrow bed in their base housing unit, she'd run through techniques in her mind, an elbow strike to Blake's solar plexus that would drop him instantly, a leg sweep that would send Tyler crashing into the concrete walls of his beloved stairwell, a chokehold that would leave Marcus unconscious on the gym floor while his friends watched in helpless terror. The fantasies were vivid and detailed. informed by years of training and fueled by months of accumulated rage. But they were also dangerous, representing a slide toward exactly the kind of thinking her father had warned her against. "The moment you start looking for excuses to hurt people," he'd told her, "is the moment you become the kind of person who needs to be stopped." Still, the fantasies persisted, growing more elaborate and satisfying with each new humiliation. And as the days passed, the line between fantasy and possibility began to blur in ways that should have terrified her, but instead felt increasingly liberating. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late October, when the desert heat was finally beginning to give way to the more moderate temperatures that made Phoenix livable. The school's ancient air conditioning system was struggling less, the hallways felt less like furnaces, and there was a general sense of relief among students and staff alike that the brutal summer was finally ending. Kaya had been looking forward to lunch period for days, not because of the food. The cafeteria offerings were barely edible under the best circumstances, but because she'd finally finished her art project. The drawing had taken her weeks to complete, a detailed pencil rendering of a phoenix rising from flames that incorporated techniques she'd learned from online tutorials and years of sketching in margins and on scraps of paper during her father's long absences. Art had always been her escape, the one place where her careful control and methodical approach translated into something beautiful rather than merely functional. While her classmates were documenting their lives on social media or bonding over shared interests, Kaya poured her energy into creating images that captured emotions she couldn't express in words. The Phoenix drawing was her most ambitious work yet, a piece that seemed to embody everything she'd been feeling since arriving at Roosevelt, the sense of being consumed by forces beyond her control, but also the hope that something better might rise from the ashes. She'd planned to submit the drawing that afternoon for the school's annual art competition, one of the few activities where her quiet nature might actually work in her favor. The competition was judged blindly, with entries identified only by student numbers rather than names, which meant her work would be evaluated on its merits rather than her social standing or reputation. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt, she had a genuine chance to excel at something, to be recognized for her abilities rather than dismissed because of her second-hand clothes and military family background. The drawing was carefully protected in a portfolio case she'd saved up to buy from her allowance, a professional quality folder that had cost more than her shoes, but seemed essential for protecting work she'd invested so much time and effort in creating. She'd positioned it on her lunch table with the same precision she brought to organizing her training space, making sure it was flat and secure while she ate her sandwich and reviewed her afternoon schedule. That's when Dylan Park approached her table, and for a moment, Kaya's carefully controlled world shifted in a direction she hadn't expected. Dylan was different from most students at Roosevelt High School in ways that went beyond mere appearance. While his classmates competed for status through expensive clothes and carefully curated social media profiles, Dylan seemed genuinely comfortable with who he was. He wore vintage band t-shirts that looked like they'd been collected over years of actual concert attendance rather than purchased for their retro appeal. His jeans were worn but clean, his sneakers scuffed but functional, and his wire-rimmed glasses, similar to her own, gave him an intellectual air that somehow managed to be attractive rather than nerdy. More importantly, Dylan had been the only student at Roosevelt to show her genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. 2 weeks earlier, when Blake had deliberately bumped into her in the cafeteria and sent her entire lunch tray crashing to the floor, Dylan had immediately appeared with napkins and offered to help clean up the mess. He hadn't made a big show of it, hadn't drawn attention to his assistants, had simply crouched down beside her and started collecting scattered items while Blake and his friends laughed from their corner table. "Don't let them see it bothers you," he'd said quietly as they worked together to clean up spilled soup and scattered chips. That's what they want. It had been the most personal advice anyone at Roosevelt had offered her, and she'd found herself thinking about his words during subsequent encounters with Blake's crew. There was something reassuring about knowing that at least one person in this place saw what was really happening, understood the dynamics at play, and cared enough to offer support, even when it might put him at risk. Now Dylan was standing beside her table with a hesitant smile, holding a lunch tray and looking around the cafeteria with the casual confidence that came from being secure in your own skin. His dark eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses held the kind of intelligence that attracted her, not the calculating intelligence that Blake used to manipulate social situations, but the genuine curiosity and thoughtfulness that came from someone who actually read books for pleasure and thought deeply about the world around him. "Hey, Kaya," he said, his voice carrying the slight nervousness that came from approaching someone new. "Mind if I sit here? The comic book club meeting got moved to tomorrow, and eating alone gets pretty old." The invitation was casual, almost thrown away, but Kaya felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fight-or-flight responses or adrenaline spikes. This was something else entirely, a flutter of possibility that she'd almost forgotten how to recognize after months of constant vigilance and defensive positioning. "Sure," she managed, carefully moving her portfolio case to make room while trying not to seem too eager. "I don't mind." Dylan slid into the seat across from her with fluid grace, setting down his tray and immediately launching into conversation with the kind of easy comfort that suggested he'd been thinking about approaching her for some time. He talked about the comic book club, about his frustration with teachers who assigned busy work instead of meaningful projects, about his plans to study graphic design in college. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Kaya found herself actually smiling as they discovered shared interests in science fiction novels and movies that explored themes of identity and belonging. For 20 precious minutes, she forgot about Blake Morrison and his carefully orchestrated campaign of harassment. She forgot about the constant vigilance that had become second nature, the way she automatically scanned rooms for threats and mapped escape routes even in supposedly safe spaces. Instead, she found herself laughing at Dylan's impression of their overly dramatic English teacher, sharing her own observations about the social ecosystem of Roosevelt High School, and actually enjoying the simple pleasure of connecting with someone who seemed to understand her perspective on the world. "You know," Dylan said as he opened his bottle of water, "I've been wanting to ask you about that drawing you were working on in study hall last week, the one with all the detailed feathers. It looked really incredible." Kaya felt her face flush with a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment. She hadn't realized anyone had been paying attention to her artwork, hadn't thought that the quiet sketching she did during free periods was visible to other students. The fact that Dylan had not only noticed but remembered details about her work made something warm unfurl in her chest. "It's actually finished," she said, gesturing toward the portfolio case. "I'm planning to submit it for the art competition this afternoon." "Can I see it?" Dylan asked, and the genuine interest in his voice made her feel brave in a way she hadn't experienced since arriving at Roosevelt. Kaya was just reaching for the portfolio case, her fingers already working at the latches, when Blake Morrison materialized beside their table, like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. Tyler Chen and Marcus Rodriguez flanked him as usual, but there was something different about their formation today. They moved with the focused intensity of predators who had spotted particularly vulnerable prey, and Blake's blue eyes held a cold fury that made her stomach clench with recognition. "Well, well," Blake said, his voice pitched to carry across the nearby tables. "Looks like the freak found another freak to hang out with." The conversation at surrounding tables began to die down as students sensed drama in the air. Kaya could feel attention turning in their direction like spotlights swiveling toward a stage, and the familiar sensation of being watched and judged began to creep up her spine. But for once, she wasn't facing this alone. Dylan looked up at Blake with calm composure, though she could see tension gathering in his shoulders like a coiled spring. "Is there something you need, Blake?" Dylan asked, his voice level and controlled in a way that suggested he'd dealt with bullies before and understood the importance of not escalating situations unnecessarily. Blake's smile was the kind that belonged on sharks, all teeth and predatory satisfaction. "What I need," he said, reaching toward Kaya's portfolio case, "is to see what our little artist has been working on so secretively." Kaya's training kicked in automatically. Her body shifted into a defensive posture without conscious thought, her hands moving to intercept Blake's reaching arm with a block that would redirect his momentum and potentially dislocate his wrist if he continued the motion. 8 years of practice had made such responses as natural as breathing, and every instinct screamed at her to follow through with the technique. But at the last second, her father's voice echoed through her mind like a military command. No fighting unless absolutely necessary, no drawing attention, no risking the disciplinary issues that could jeopardize my career. The words hit her like a physical blow, disrupting her trained responses and leaving her frozen in the terrible space between action and inaction. Blake's hand closed around the portfolio case before she could complete her defensive movement. He lifted it with theatrical flourish, holding it above his head like a trophy, while his friends gathered closer and the surrounding students turned to watch the performance. "Please," Kaya whispered, rising from her seat with her hands extended in supplication, "just give it back. You don't understand. That's weeks of work." "Weeks of work?" Blake repeated, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Well then, we'd better take a look and see what all the fuss is about." He opened the case with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment and the attention it brought him. When he pulled out her Phoenix drawing, holding it up for the surrounding tables to see, Kaya felt something inside her chest crack like ice beginning to break under pressure. "Oh, look, everybody," Blake announced, his voice projecting across the cafeteria with practiced ease. "The invisible girl made us a picture." Several students turned to watch, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable amusement to genuine curiosity. Some pulled out phones, sensing that something worth recording was about to unfold. Kaya felt her face burning as Blake waved her artwork around like a flag, months of careful work reduced to entertainment for people who had never shown the slightest interest in her existence. The Phoenix drawing itself was beautiful. Even she had to admit that. The bird's wings were spread wide as it emerged from stylized flames, every feather rendered with careful attention to light and shadow. The flames beneath were drawn with flowing lines that suggested both destruction and renewal, while the Phoenix's eyes held an expression of fierce determination that had taken her days to perfect. It was the best work she'd ever done, a piece that captured not just technical skill, but genuine emotion and meaning. But in Blake's hands, it became something else entirely. Evidence of her otherness, proof that she spent time on activities that the popular crowd found weird or unnecessary. Art was tolerated at Roosevelt when it served social functions like decorating for dances or creating posters for sporting events. Personal artistic expression, especially the kind that revealed depth and vulnerability, was seen as suspicious at best and pathetically pretentious at worst. "You know what this needs?" Tyler said, producing a bottle of chocolate milk from his lunch tray with the timing of someone who had been planning this moment. "Some color." "No." Kaya lunged forward, but Marcus was already moving to intercept her. His hand closed around her arm with enough force to leave bruises, his grip designed to restrain without appearing overtly violent to the growing audience of phone cameras that were now documenting every moment of her humiliation. She watched helplessly as Tyler popped the cap on his chocolate milk and held it above her drawing with theatrical precision. The brown liquid poured out in a steady stream, soaking through the paper and destroying weeks of careful work in seconds. The detailed feathers began to blur and run. The carefully shaded flames dissolved into muddy brown streaks, and the phoenix's fierce eyes disappeared beneath spreading stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Dylan had risen from his seat, his face flushed with anger, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Leave her alone." Blake's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing with the predatory focus that Kaya had learned to fear above all else. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the inevitable escalation that would drag Dylan into the crosshairs of Blake's carefully maintained reign of terror. She wanted to warn him, to tell him to walk away and save himself, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely. "Or what, book boy?" Blake asked, stepping closer to Dylan with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation. "You gonna protect your little girlfriend? She's not..." Dylan started, but Blake was already moving. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each moment stretching out like frames in a film reel. Blake grabbed the front of Dylan's vintage Led Zeppelin t-shirt and shoved him backward with enough force to send him stumbling into another table. Students scattered as Dylan tried to regain his balance, his arms windmilling as he fought to stay upright. His wire-rimmed glasses flew off his face and skittered across the linoleum floor, the delicate frames no match for the sudden impact. Dylan went down hard, his hip connecting with the edge of a lunch table before he hit the ground. The sound of the impact carried across the now silent cafeteria, and several students gasped or exclaimed in shock. Dylan lay on the floor for a moment, stunned and obviously in pain, before pushing himself up onto one elbow and looking around with the confused expression of someone whose world had suddenly shifted without warning. "Oops," Blake said with mock concern, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction that came from demonstrating dominance in front of an audience. "Looks like Loverboy is clumsier than his girlfriend." The cafeteria had gone completely silent, except for the electronic beeping of phones recording the encounter, and a few nervous giggles from Blake's usual supporters. Kaya looked around desperately for a teacher, for any adult who might intervene and put an end to this escalating nightmare, but the lunch monitors were conveniently absent from this section of the room. It was as if the universe had conspired to leave them completely vulnerable at the moment when they most needed protection. Blake turned his attention back to her, and she saw something new and terrible in his expression, a cruel excitement that went beyond his usual calculated meanness. This wasn't just about maintaining social hierarchy anymore. This had become personal, a demonstration of power that required complete and total victory over anyone who dared to challenge his authority. "You know what?" Blake said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he was about to cross lines that even he usually respected. "I think it's time we helped you find some school spirit." Before Kaya could react, before her training could kick in, before she could even process what was happening, Blake grabbed the hem of her oversized flannel shirt and yanked upward with enough force to pop several buttons. The fabric came up and over her head in one fluid motion, revealing the thin white tank top she wore underneath and leaving her standing in the center of the cafeteria, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she'd ever felt in her entire life. Time seemed to freeze. Kaya stood there with her shirt in Blake's hands, wearing only a thin undershirt that left her feeling completely defenseless, despite the fact that she was technically still covered. She could hear gasps and whispers starting up around the cafeteria, could see phones being raised to capture her humiliation for social media posterity, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes taking in her moment of complete vulnerability. The shame was overwhelming, washing over her in waves that made her feel dizzy and nauseous. This was worse than any physical pain she'd ever experienced, worse than any injury she'd sustained during years of martial arts training. This was the kind of humiliation that would follow her for the rest of her time at Roosevelt High School, the kind of moment that would be referenced and remembered and used against her for as long as she remained in this place. She could see Dylan struggling to get up from the floor, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he searched for his glasses. She could hear the whispers starting, the sound of her social death being documented in real time by classmates who would go home and tell their parents about the weird military girl who got her shirt pulled off in the cafeteria. She could see Blake's triumphant smile, the satisfaction in his eyes as he achieved what he clearly considered the ultimate victory over someone he deemed unworthy of basic human dignity. But most of all, she could feel something inside her breaking. Not just her dignity or her sense of safety, but the careful control that had kept her training separate from her daily life, that had maintained the distinction between Kaya, the quiet military kid, and Kaya, the weapon her father had helped forge over 8 years of disciplined practice. The breaking was almost audible, like ice cracking under too much pressure, like glass reaching its stress limit and finally shattering into pieces that could never be put back together. And with that breaking came a flood of rage, so pure and focused that it burned away everything else, the shame, the fear, her father's warnings, the potential consequences of her actions. 8 years of training took over. Kaya moved faster than Blake's reflexes could process, faster than his brain could register the transition from victim to threat. Her right elbow drove upward in a perfect striking arc, a technique she'd practiced thousands of times against heavy bags and training partners, delivered now with the full force of months of accumulated rage and humiliation. The strike connected with the soft spot just below Blake's ribcage, the vulnerable area where ribs met diaphragm with enough precision and power to lift him slightly off his feet. The impact drove all the air from Blake's lungs in a single explosive exhalation, a sound like a balloon popping that carried across the silent cafeteria. His grip on her shirt went slack as his hands instinctively moved to protect his injured torso, his body automatically responding to the trauma of an expertly delivered strike. His blue eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been fear as he doubled over, struggling to remember how to breathe. Kaya caught her shirt as it fell from Blake's nerveless fingers, quickly pulling it back on despite the missing buttons. The flannel hung open now, held together only by the bottom 2 buttons, but she no longer cared about modesty or appearance. Something fundamental had shifted inside her, and the quiet girl who had spent months absorbing abuse without retaliation had been replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Tyler Chen rushed forward to help his friend, moving with the kind of panic that came from seeing your seemingly invincible leader reduced to gasping vulnerability. But Kaya was already in motion, her body flowing through defensive patterns that had become as natural as breathing. She pivoted on her left foot and drove her right knee upward, catching Tyler in the solar plexus with enough precision to target the cluster of nerves that would send shockwaves through his entire nervous system. Tyler's forward momentum carried him straight into the strike, and the impact sent him stumbling backward with his hands pressed to his chest and his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He collided with Marcus Rodriguez, who was trying to circle around behind Kaya, and both boys went down in a tangle of limbs and confusion. Tyler was gasping for air, while Marcus swore creatively as he tried to untangle himself from his friend's flailing arms. The cafeteria erupted in shouts and exclamations. Students jumped on tables to get better views of what was happening. Phones appeared everywhere to record the unprecedented sight of Blake Morrison and his crew being systematically dismantled by the quiet girl they'd been tormenting for months. The sound level rose dramatically as everyone tried to process what they were witnessing. their voices creating a wall of noise that seemed to press in from all directions. Blake had managed to straighten up somewhat, though he was still holding his ribs and breathing in short, painful gasps. His face had gone from its usual confident tan to an alarming shade of red that suggested both physical distress and complete humiliation. The perfectly styled blonde hair was disheveled now, and his blue eyes held the shell-shocked expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been violently rearranged. "You little," Blake started, his voice coming out as more of a wheeze than actual words. But rage overcame pain, and he lunged forward with his fists raised, moving with the clumsy aggression of someone who had always relied on size and intimidation rather than actual fighting skill. Kaya sidestepped his attack with fluid grace, her body moving through defensive patterns that her sensei in Las Vegas had made her practice until they became instinctive. Blake's momentum carried him past her, and she grabbed his extended wrist with both hands, using his own forward motion to send him sprawling across a nearby lunch table. Physics and leverage did most of the work. She simply provided direction and timing. Blake landed face first in a pile of mashed potatoes and gravy that some student had abandoned when the fight started. The impact sent food flying in all directions, and when he pushed himself up, his perfect hair was dripping with cafeteria gravy, and his expensive polo shirt was decorated with chunks of institutional potatoes. The transformation from confident predator to food-covered victim was so complete and dramatic that several students actually laughed out loud despite their shock. Marcus Rodriguez had finally gotten back to his feet and was circling around behind her, trying to grab her arms and pin them to her sides in a move that might have worked against an ordinary teenage girl, but was completely inadequate against someone who had spent years learning how to deal with exactly such attacks. Kaya sensed his approach without turning around, her peripheral vision and trained awareness tracking his movement like radar. She dropped her weight and drove her left elbow backward into Marcus's midsection, the strike connecting with his liver in a way that sent shockwaves through his entire body. He doubled over with a grunt of pain, and she pivoted smoothly to face him, before sweeping his legs out from under him with a technique that her Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor had made her practice until she could do it in her sleep. Marcus hit the linoleum floor hard, his head connecting with a sound that made several students wince in sympathetic pain. He lay there, groaning and showing no inclination whatsoever to continue the fight, his role in Blake's hierarchy apparently not worth the kind of punishment Kaya was capable of delivering. Tyler Chen was still on his knees, holding his stomach and trying to catch his breath. He looked up at Kaya with newfound respect and more than a little fear, clearly reconsidering any thoughts he might have had about rejoining the conflict. The cruel confidence that had characterized his previous interactions with her was completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed wariness of someone who had just learned that their victim was actually a predator in disguise. Blake slowly pushed himself up from the lunch table, mashed potatoes sliding off his face as he tried to regain some semblance of dignity. His expensive clothing was ruined, his perfect hair was a disaster, and his blue eyes held the shell-shocked expression of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered in the span of 30 seconds. He looked around the cafeteria, taking in the sea of faces, watching his humiliation, the phones recording his defeat, the complete collapse of the carefully maintained image that had defined his identity for years. "How did you—" Blake started, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The elbow strike to his diaphragm had done exactly what it was designed to do, disrupting his breathing and leaving him struggling to speak above a whisper. Kaya stood in the center of the chaos, her flannel shirt hanging open, but her posture radiating confidence for the first time since she'd arrived at Roosevelt High School. Her auburn curls had escaped their constraints, and now framed her face like a wild halo, and behind her wire-rimmed glasses, her eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there an hour earlier. She looked down at Blake, who was still trying to clean cafeteria food from his face, and felt a surge of power that was both intoxicating and dangerous. For a moment, every instinct screamed at her to finish what Blake had started. He was vulnerable now, humiliated and defenseless, completely at her mercy in front of an audience that was documenting everything. She could easily put him down permanently, could make him feel the same helplessness and fear he'd inflicted on her for months. Her training had taught her dozens of ways to inflict serious damage, and part of her wanted to use every single technique she'd ever learned to make him understand what it felt like to be completely powerless while surrounded by people who did nothing to help. The temptation was overwhelming. Blake Morrison, the golden boy who had made her life miserable, was kneeling on the cafeteria floor covered in mashed potatoes and struggling to breathe. His friends were either unconscious or too afraid to help him. The entire social hierarchy that had protected him and enabled his cruelty was crumbling in real time, as his classmates watched him be systematically destroyed by someone they'd all dismissed as harmless. She could finish it. She could make sure he never bothered anyone again. She could be the instrument of justice that this place had been lacking, the equalizer that would protect future victims from experiencing what she'd endured. But as she looked around the silent cafeteria, she saw Dylan struggling to find his glasses, his face bruised from where he'd hit the table while trying to defend her. She saw other students watching with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to genuine fear. And she remembered her father's words about the difference between strength and cruelty, between defending yourself and becoming the monster you fought against. Real warriors know when to stop, he'd told her countless times during their training sessions. Anyone can hurt someone when they're angry. It takes real strength to show mercy when you have the power to destroy. The memory cut through her rage like cold water, reminding her of who she was supposed to be, of the values her father had tried to instill alongside the physical techniques. She was Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan's daughter, raised to be strong but not cruel, trained to defend herself but not to become an aggressor, taught to use violence as a last resort rather than a first choice. Blake was struggling to get to his feet, using the lunch table for support as he tried to regain his balance. His movements were slow and careful, suggesting that her elbow strike had done significant damage to his ability to breathe normally. When he finally managed to stand, he swayed slightly, one hand still pressed to his ribs, while the other tried unsuccessfully to clean mashed potatoes from his hair. In that moment, Kaya made a choice that surprised everyone in the cafeteria, including herself. Instead of delivering the finishing blow that her training and her rage demanded, instead of cementing her dominance over someone who had shown her nothing but cruelty, she extended her hand toward Blake in a gesture that was completely unexpected. "Get up," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. Blake stared at her extended hand as if it might be a trap, his eyes darting between her face and the dozens of students who were still recording everything on their phones. The cafeteria remained completely silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next, whether this was genuine mercy or simply a setup for another humiliation. After a long moment, Blake grudgingly accepted her help, allowing her to pull him to his feet, despite the obvious humiliation of needing assistance from someone he'd spent months trying to destroy. His grip was weak, and she could feel him trembling slightly, whether from pain, shock, or residual adrenaline. "This isn't over," Blake muttered, but his voice lacked any trace of its usual authority. The words sounded hollow, the threat of someone who had just discovered that their power was built on foundations much weaker than they'd believed. "Yes, it is," Kaya replied calmly, meeting his eyes with steady confidence. "And if you ever touch me or anyone else like that again, next time, I won't pull my punches." The promise in her voice was unmistakable, and Blake seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. The easy victim he'd been tormenting for months was gone, replaced by someone who had just demonstrated the capacity for violence that went far beyond anything he could bring to bear. The social hierarchy that had protected him meant nothing against someone who could systematically dismantle him and his friends in front of the entire school. The cafeteria remained silent for several more seconds before erupting into chaos. Students rushed forward, some to check on Tyler and Marcus, who were still struggling to recover from their encounters with Kaya's knees and elbows, others to congratulate her or ask how she'd learned to fight with such devastating effectiveness. Several people offered her their own shirts or jackets to replace her damaged flannel, while others helped Dylan locate his glasses and offered ice for the bruises he'd sustained when Blake had shoved him. "Holy shit," someone said nearby, their voice filled with admiration and disbelief. "Did you see how fast she moved? Blake didn't even have time to react. Where did she learn to fight like that?" another student asked. "That was like something out of a movie." "I heard her dad's in the military," came a response. "Maybe he taught her." The whispered conversations spread throughout the cafeteria as students tried to process what they'd witnessed. Within minutes, the story was being shared via text messages and social media posts, spreading throughout Roosevelt High School faster than any official announcement could have traveled. Videos of the fight were already being uploaded to various platforms, despite the school's policies against such recordings. By the end of lunch period, Kaya Brennan had gone from invisible nobody to school legend. The quiet girl who had absorbed months of harassment without retaliation had revealed herself to be something far more formidable than anyone had imagined. The transformation was complete and irreversible. There would be no going back to anonymity and carefully maintained invisibility. The immediate aftermath brought exactly the kind of administrative attention that her father had warned her to avoid. Principal Williams arrived within minutes of the fight's conclusion, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene of scattered food, overturned chairs, and students still buzzing with excitement over what they'd witnessed. Behind him came Assistant Principal Johnson, the school resource officer, and several teachers who had finally materialized now that the actual violence was over. "Everyone back to your seats," Principal Williams commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing teenage chaos. "Anyone not directly involved in this incident needs to clear the area immediately." But determining who was directly involved proved more complicated than the administration had anticipated. Within minutes, dozens of students were coming forward with their own accounts of what had happened, and their testimony painted a very different picture than the simple cafeteria fight that the adults had initially assumed they were dealing with. Emma Walsh, the quiet girl from Kaya's chemistry class, surprised everyone by speaking up with a detailed account of the harassment she'd witnessed over the past months. Her voice shook as she described Blake's campaign of psychological torture, but she was thorough and specific in ways that made it clear she'd been paying attention even when she hadn't been willing to intervene. "It wasn't just today," Emma told Principal Williams, her hands clenched nervously in front of her. "Blake and his friends have been targeting her since she started here. They knocked her food on the floor, they knocked her books down, they cornered her in stairwells. What happened today was it was the last straw when he pulled her shirt off." Other students began adding their own observations, creating a chorus of testimony that corroborated Emma's account. Even students who hadn't been directly involved admitted to witnessing incidents that they'd previously dismissed as harmless pranks or typical teenage social dynamics. The picture that emerged was of systematic harassment that had escalated over months, while adults remained either oblivious or deliberately blind to what was happening. "Blake Morrison grabbed her shirt and pulled it over her head," said Jessica Martinez, a senior who had been sitting 3 tables away. "She was just sitting there eating lunch with Dylan, and Blake came over and humiliated her in front of everyone. That's when she fought back." "They poured chocolate milk on her artwork," added Tommy Chen, no relation to Tyler despite sharing a surname. "She'd been working on this drawing for weeks, and Tyler just destroyed it for no reason. They were just being cruel. The security cameras in the cafeteria confirmed these accounts, showing Blake's initial approach to Kaya's table, his deliberate destruction of her artwork, his physical assault on Dylan, and finally, his decision to remove her shirt in front of hundreds of witnesses. The footage made it clear that Kaya's violent response had been preceded by months of harassment that had culminated in what could reasonably be classified as sexual assault. The legal implications were significant enough to require phone calls to parents and consultations with district administrators. Blake Morrison's father, the prominent attorney, arrived at the school within an hour of being contacted, his expensive suit and confident demeanor suggesting someone accustomed to making problems disappear through legal maneuvering. But even his considerable influence couldn't change what the cameras had recorded or what dozens of witnesses had testified to seeing. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan arrived in uniform, having left his duties at Luke Air Force Base the moment he received the call from the school. Kaya had been dreading this moment since the fight ended, knowing that her actions had potentially jeopardized everything he'd worked for in his military career. But when he walked into the principal's office and saw her sitting there with her shirt hanging open and her artwork destroyed, his expression softened in a way that surprised her. "Are you hurt?" was the first thing he asked, his voice carrying the controlled concern of someone trained to assess situations quickly and prioritically. "No, sir," Kaya replied, using the formal address that came naturally when he was in uniform. "I'm okay." Staff Sergeant Brennan nodded once, then turned his attention to Principal Williams with the focused intensity that had served him well in dealing with military bureaucracy. "I'd like to see the security footage and speak with the witnesses before we discuss disciplinary actions." The investigation that followed was thorough and professional, guided by the school district's zero-tolerance policies regarding both harassment and violence. Blake Morrison received a 2-week suspension for assault, harassment, and what the report carefully classified as inappropriate physical contact. Tyler Chen and Marcus Rodriguez each received 3-day suspensions for their participation in the destruction of property and the assault on Dillon Park. All 3 were required to complete anger management counseling and write formal apologies that would be read during morning announcements. Kaya received 1 day of in-school suspension for fighting, but the punishment felt more symbolic than genuine discipline. Principal Williams was clearly relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further and privately admitted to Staff Sergeant Brennan that he was impressed by his daughter's restraint in not seriously injuring students who had clearly provoked the confrontation. "She could have done much worse," Principal Williams said during their private conversation. "The fact that she pulled her punches and helped Blake up afterward shows remarkable self-control for someone with her training background." Staff Sergeant Brennan nodded grimly. "That's what we've been working on for 8 years. Strength without cruelty. The ability to defend yourself without becoming what you're fighting against." The conversation with her father that evening was different from what Kaya had expected. She'd prepared for disappointment, for lectures about control and consequences, for the possibility that her actions might impact his upcoming promotion review. Instead, Staff Sergeant Brennan sat across from her at their small kitchen table and asked for her complete account of everything that had happened since she'd started at Roosevelt. Kaya told him everything. The daily harassment, the deliberate isolation, the way teachers and administrators had systematically failed to address behavior that was clearly crossing lines. She described the psychological pressure, the escalating physical intimidation, the way Blake's crew had used their social status to create an environment where cruelty was not just tolerated but rewarded. When she finished, her father was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands folded on the table between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years thinking about violence and its proper applications. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected that she actually gasped. But I fought. I broke the rules. You defended yourself, Staff Sergeant Brennan interrupted. You waited until you had no other choice. You used minimal necessary force, and you showed mercy when you had the power to inflict serious damage. That's not breaking the rules, Kaya. That's following them perfectly. He leaned forward, his expression serious but warm. Real strength isn't about avoiding all conflict. It's about knowing when conflict is necessary and handling it with honor when it comes. You did exactly what I've been trying to teach you for 8 years. The changes at Roosevelt High School were immediate and dramatic. Students who had previously looked through Kaya now approached her with curious respect, wanting to know about her martial arts background and how she'd learned to fight with such devastating precision. The story of her confrontation with Blake Morrison spread beyond the school, becoming part of local teenage folklore and inspiring other victims of harassment to find their own voices. More importantly, the culture of fear that Blake had carefully cultivated began to crumble as people realized that bullies were neither invincible nor untouchable. Emma Walsh started speaking up in class when she disagreed with something, her newfound confidence inspiring other quiet students to find their own voices. Several freshmen came forward with their own stories of intimidation and harassment, leading to additional investigations and disciplinary actions. Teachers who had been conveniently blind to harassment suddenly became much more attentive to classroom dynamics. The administration implemented new policies regarding social media recordings and cyberbullying, partly in response to the videos of Kaya's fight that had spread throughout the student body. Zero-tolerance policies were actually enforced rather than selectively applied based on social status and family connections. Dylan Park became a regular presence at Kaya's lunch table, their friendship deepening into something that made her heart race whenever he smiled at her. The shared experience of being targeted by Blake's cruelty had created a bond between them, but what grew from that foundation was genuine affection based on shared interests and compatible personalities. Dylan never asked her to fight his battles, but his quiet support and genuine admiration helped her find balance between her warrior training and her desire to fit in peacefully. "You know what I like most about you?" Dylan asked one afternoon as they shared a table in the library, working on their respective homework assignments. Kaya looked up from her algebra textbook, pushing her glasses up her nose in the gesture that had become automatic. "What's that?" "You're not what you appear to be," Dylan said, his dark eyes serious behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Everyone sees this quiet girl who keeps to herself, but underneath that, you're fierce. Not mean or cruel, just fierce. Like you know exactly who you are and what you're capable of." The observation made her blush, but it also made her think about the changes she'd experienced since the cafeteria incident. She was still quiet, still preferred books to parties and artwork to gossip, but the desperate need for invisibility had been replaced by something healthier. She no longer felt the need to disappear. Instead, she'd learned to occupy space with confidence, while remaining true to her naturally introverted personality. Blake Morrison himself underwent the most dramatic transformation of anyone involved in the incident. The humiliation of being defeated so publicly, combined with the loss of social standing that came from being exposed as someone whose power was built on cruelty rather than genuine leadership, forced him to confront realities about himself that he'd been avoiding for years. The formal apology he was required to read during morning announcements was awkward and clearly scripted by his lawyer father, but it was followed by a private conversation with Kaya that felt more genuine. 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident, he approached her during lunch period, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible in a way that suggested he understood how completely their dynamic had changed. "Can we talk?" Blake asked. his voice lacking any trace of its former authority. Kaya looked up from her sandwich, studying his face for signs of deception or manipulation. Blake looked different now. His perfect hair was less perfectly styled, his expensive clothes seemed to hang differently on his frame, and his blue eyes held an uncertainty that suggested genuine introspection. "What do you want to say?" she asked, neither hostile nor welcoming. Blake sat down across from her, moving carefully as if he were still feeling the effects of their encounter. "I wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not the legal stuff my dad made me read." "Okay." "I never thought about how it felt," Blake admitted, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "I guess I figured if someone couldn't fight back, they deserved whatever happened to them, like it was natural selection or something." Kaya studied his face, looking for signs that this was another form of manipulation, but found only uncomfortable honesty. "That's not how the world works," she replied. "Being able to hurt someone doesn't give you the right to do it." Blake nodded slowly, still favoring his left side, where her elbow had connected with surgical precision. "I'm trying to be different. It's harder than I thought it would be." "Why?" Kaya asked, genuinely curious. "Why try to change now?" Blake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because I saw what you could have done to me that day, and you chose not to. You could have put me in the hospital, but instead you helped me up. I keep thinking about that choice you made and wondering what kind of person I am that I never made choices like that for other people." The conversation was awkward and incomplete, but it represented something that Kaya had never expected to see from Blake Morrison. Genuine self-reflection and a recognition that his behavior had consequences beyond his own immediate gratification. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness would require time and consistent evidence of change. But she respected the fact that he was making an effort to understand the damage he'd caused. 2 months later, as winter finally brought relief from the desert heat and Roosevelt High School settled into the rhythm of a new semester, Kaya walked through the hallways with a confidence that felt completely natural. Students called out greetings, invited her to study groups, and asked for her advice when they encountered their own bullying situations. She'd started an informal self-defense club that met after school, teaching basic techniques to anyone who wanted to learn, but more importantly, helping other students understand that they didn't have to accept harassment as an inevitable part of the high school experience. The art competition had been rescheduled due to the cafeteria incident, giving Kaya time to create a new piece that reflected her experiences at Roosevelt. The new drawing depicted a group of students standing together, protecting someone smaller who was being surrounded by larger, more threatening figures. She called it "Finding Your Voice," and while it lacked the technical perfection of her destroyed Phoenix drawing, it carried an emotional weight that resonated with both judges and viewers. When the winners were announced during morning assembly, Kaya's name was called for first place in the school-wide competition. As she walked to the front of the auditorium to accept her award, she could hear genuine applause from classmates who had learned to see her as something other than an easy target. The recognition felt good, but it was secondary to the more important realization that she'd found her place in this community without sacrificing the parts of herself that mattered most. As she sat in the cafeteria with Dylan and their growing circle of friends, Kaya reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd learned that invisibility wasn't always protection, that sometimes the only way to find peace was to be willing to fight for it, and that standing up for yourself didn't have to mean becoming the very thing you fought against. The phoenix she'd drawn months earlier was gone, destroyed by chocolate milk and cruelty in a moment that had felt like the end of everything. But like the mythical bird it depicted, something new had risen from those ashes. Something stronger, fiercer, and impossible to ignore. She was still Kaya Brennan, still the quiet military kid with second-hand clothes and wire-rimmed glasses. But she was also someone who understood her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it when necessary. Most importantly, she'd learned that true power didn't come from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when mercy was stronger than violence, when helping someone up was more devastating than knocking them down, and when the choice to show restraint demonstrated more courage than the decision to show none at all. The lesson would serve her well in the years to come, as she navigated college and career choices, as she built relationships and faced new challenges, as she continued to grow into the kind of person her father had always believed she could become. She was no longer invisible, no longer powerless, no longer afraid. She was simply herself, and that was more than enough.